Most of the leaders I know right now are really struggling to get by, and they feel like failures. I think this is particularly important for leaders who are trapped between yesterday's expectations and today's realities.
When my boss tells me I have permission to do things, really mean I have permission to do things the way they want, not to ask questions or do things the way that I want.
Personal change management needs to now be considered like a 21st century skill set, capability, whatever you want to call it. I describe it as finding your way versus following the way. So there were very clearly paved paths and people telling us where to go, and now we have to rely more on ourselves.
Whether you want more innovation more easily, you're feeling burnt out or overwhelmed, or you simply know that something isn't quite the way you know it can be, you are not alone. I hear the same from leaders every day. On Uncommon Leadership, we explore aligning personal fulfillment with business success, creating authentic teams, and cultivating the resilience, adaptability, and ease necessary to move beyond simply surviving today's challenges into thriving. I'm Michael Hunter with Uncommon Teams, and today we'll uncover fresh insights into what it means to lead today. And joining me is Jillian Reilly. Jillian is a founder, writer, keynote speaker, and consultant. Having spent her 30-year career working in social, organizational, and individual change across Africa, Asia, and Central Europe, Jillian's focus is on helping people unlock their ability to navigate change and accelerate growth and learning. Jillian's upcoming book, The 10 Permissions, guides readers in permitting themselves to design lives that fully leverage the possibilities of our disruptive world, offering 10 direct ways to turn stuck-in-the-past work and life strategies on their head. Welcome, Jillian.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
I have been looking forward to this conversation since we talked a few weeks ago.
Yeah, me too. I love what you're doing, so I'm excited that I get to be a part of it.
You and I kind of read the same book, only in very different ways.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's different entry points to the same subjects, right?
Yeah, absolutely. When did you first recognize that integrating your whole self and bringing that into everything that you do might be a valuable approach?
Oh gosh. Um, I guess it would be at a very young age because I started to do work in social change and individual personal change early on. I went from the United States, from the Midwest of America to here to South Africa, where I still am, and sort of got thrown into the deep end of doing community-based change. And I think I realized early on that the more that I brought of myself and the more that I, was willing to share of myself as not just a professional, but a human, um, the better connection I made with people, the richer the conversations were. We sort of moved beyond the transactional into something that felt like it had a better chance of making a difference and making meaning. So I think as somebody who has spent my life going into people's lives at vulnerable moments, at challenging moments, at, very rich moments, I definitely have found that the more that I was willing to share of myself and the more that I was willing to be real about my own journey, the better, I don't want to say the outcome, but certainly the better the connection.
What has most helped you maintain those connections as you've grown and changed over from when you first started this through now?
Yeah, that's a great question because I have to be honest, I stepped away for a while when I decided to have my first child. I thought, okay, I think I'm going to use this as a very intentional break from the kind of, at that point, I'd left Africa and I was working as a consultant. And I felt like things were getting a little bit rote, like I knew how to land somewhere or show up with any team or sit down with any leader. And I I think I felt like I had slipped into a little bit of an autopilot mode. And it was time for me to step back, and having a child was a good way to do that. And then when I decided to step back into this work, honestly, I think having the child had done me a world of good, because in many ways it had introduced me to parts of myself that I hadn't really accessed very much before. There was a playfulness there, there was a forgiveness there. So in some ways, I was more open than I'd ever been. And if I just, I said to myself, if I'm going to keep doing this work, then I've got to keep accessing all sorts of different parts. The minute that I feel like I'm just consultant for hire, you know, bringing out a sort of standard playbook, I'm out. So I think there's just a degree of real intentionality, and trying to really be in whatever room you're in whatever conversation you're in. But it's a practice. It's just a practice of intentionality, I think.
Many of the leaders I talk with come to me in part because they have trouble integrating their work selves alongside everything else.
Yeah.
Either they feel or they've been told they can't bring all their everything else into the workplace, or they want to do this, they're perfectly free to do it, and they just don't know how, or it feels weird or uncomfortable.
Sure.
What helps you do that integration?
Um, I will say, to use my own language, I think women have, in some ways, more permission socially to do that. I think we are allowed to tap a wider range of emotions and experiences. And it feels more natural for us to go there, if you will. On the other hand, I think a lot of our personal lives and our lives as mothers and other things are a little bit off limits in many ways. I think the more that you kind of approach things from a very um, human level, and an understanding that each one of us is coming into this space as a human. I think in the workplace, a lot of our formal roles have unraveled a little bit, and that creates a bit of confusion. It's not the formal, stiff, sort of very positional interactions that it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Now people are sort of trying to figure out what's allowed and what isn't allowed. So, one of the things I do with workplaces and with leaders is to help them create more intentional cultures around helping people to understand what's allowed now. Like, am I allowed to talk about my family, to talk about my emotions, to talk about my issues? Um, and I think I try to just have very direct questions that just or conversations, if you will, that just directly get there. Sort of, you know, are we allowed to go there? Is this relevant for this conversation? I think the more explicit that you are, and the more intentional you are about, setting expectations and boundaries within conversations and relationships, you take out the guesswork, you take out that fearful kind of, oh my gosh, have I overshared? Um, but there's space now for us to do this. I think everybody's accepted the fact that we are all, complex creatures. So I would encourage people just to take it head on. And as I said, to be as explicit and intentional about creating shared boundaries and expectations.
Are those shared boundaries and expectations, is that the primary tool to use that helps people who haven't felt safe or comfortable or allowed talking about whatever the untalkable things are to bring those in?
Yeah, I mean, we all carry this deep fear that, we're going to be rejected, we're going to be judged, we're going to get into trouble. Um, one of the things I talk about in my book is that we're raised in cultures of permission, where we seek permission, particularly to share things or to do things that potentially feel outside the norm, right? May I do, may I speak, may I? And what we haven't done, and what we don't do, is to really prepare adults to give themselves permission, and then to work with each other to create a shared understanding of what permission is. And I think when workplaces were very formal, when, we did sort of operate in a far more fixed environments, it didn't feel quite as relevant. Now, I think that lack of safety also comes from a lack of clarity. Brené Brown has this great line, which is clarity is kindness. When we're clear about our shared understanding, as you've just said, boundaries and expectations, then we're operating at least from a place of awareness and knowing. And, it might be that we're out of alignment in terms of what we think is allowed or should be allowed, but at least then we can discuss it and I can make a decision about whether the explicit sort of permissions are in line with what I need and want. I think in many ways it's the ambiguity, the lack of intentional dialogue and clarity around who are we allowed to be in this space that creates that feeling of lack of safety.
If I'm a leader who wants to create more of this clarity around boundaries, expectations, and I'm not sure how to get started. I care about my team, so I want to do this in a way that works for them and isn't just me forcing everyone to now be clear and have the boundaries and expectations that I might feel are right. How can I start that conversation, and how do I ensure that it goes well?
Yeah, well, I don't think you're ever going to be sure that a conversation is going to go well, right? But what is well? I mean, as long as you can surface some of what you wanted to surface, I personally would say that by asking the question, um, you've achieved something, because what you've then done is, I'm going to use my language again, create permission for things to be voiced that perhaps previously people weren't sure that they could be. So, I would, again, be as open as I felt comfortable coming, and I would do it individually to start with. I don't think that getting people around a whole table and expecting them to have hugely revelatory conversations is particularly helpful as a starting point. I think having one-to-one spaces where people feel more comfortable, where you also can say, "Hey, look," and max out your sense of honesty and openness around your intentions, because I think that's what is often, on people's minds. Why is he doing this? Why is she raising this? Is there something else going on? Will this be used against me? What's going to happen here? So I think it's kind of being clear, not just about the purpose of the conversation, but the intent behind it. I'm coming here because I want to know this for this reason. Um, I think it's incredibly helpful to people when you share your own potentially lack of certainty or clarity or confusion around things, like own the fact that you're also not necessarily clear of, how this is all going to unfold, but you feel it needs to open. Um, and I think ask questions. I think when people want to feel heard, they want to feel connected, and I think oftentimes leaders feel like they have to come with answers and come with, directives. And I think more and more leading with questions, leading with curiosity, leading with receptivity is just a signal to everybody else that it's okay. I'm genuinely interested, not I'm collecting data.
So that initial one-on-one conversation, we might open it something like, I'm trying to give myself more permission to talk about things that I haven't felt we could talk about.
Right?
I want you also to feel that you have permission to talk with me about anything that's on your mind, and especially that anything you may have felt you can't talk to me or others about. And my only expectation here is that we're able to have a more authentic and complete conversation than maybe we've been able to have in the past.
Yeah.
How do you feel when I say this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, One of the reasons that I began to kind of work with this theme of permission is because it's very visceral. Everybody knows immediately not only what it means, but what it feels like. It's an integral part of most of our coming of age processes in one way or another. And so we both know what it feels like to be permitted, to feel free and relaxed and safe and at ease. Um, we also know what it feels like to not. And so I think one of the interesting things is by using that word, it shifts conversations a little bit in which people kind of go, "Oh, okay, wow, all right." He's he's talking about feeling safe and at ease. Do I feel that? Do I not feel that? I mean, again, I think you could start it that way. You could start it with a question. I'm curious whether how much you feel permitted to share your feelings and thoughts and ideas and how you don't. But I find that conversations around themes of permission kind of open relatively quickly because people start to access a lot of their own sort of experiences with it, and they can work with it, right? They can work with it quite easily. So I think it's a great conversation starter.
For people who are listening who say, yeah, this is all great, but when my boss tells me I have permission to do things, she, they really mean I have permission to do things the way they want, not to ask questions or do things the way that I want. How can, how do you suggest those people turn the not a real permission into authentic permission?
Yeah, well, it isn't if they're not really allowed, is it? It's a directive sort of masquerading as something else. One of the other rules, one of the other words that I use is rules, which is another way into this conversation, which is, let's talk about what the rules are here. Which is the same thing, right? What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? But it's also an interesting one because you get people kind of going, oh, wait, are there rules? Yeah, there are. Most of which are implicit, right? I mean, very few workplaces with adults have written down rules as to how you're supposed to behave or not. But sometimes an entry point into this is just for everybody to get clear about. And sometimes it's easier around specific things, meetings, the Monday morning meeting or the weekly debrief or the quarterly performance review. What are the rules? And you can break it down even further. What are the rules in terms of what we're allowed to say, da 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 da. And by getting, again, super clear about what those are on every front, you can then kind of hold them to it. Well, you said this, or you can push them a little bit in terms of, well, I thought one of the rules was that we were supposed to be able to, you know, give open feedback to each other, but I did that and you then penalized me. So, the more things are explicit, the easier they are to work with. The more everything stays implicit, the more fuzziness it creates. So, I do a lot of work with teams around making implicit ways of operating explicit in order to allow for us to hold each other accountable, if you will. If somebody doesn't want to be held accountable, and if somebody wants to use their positional authority to break whatever rules you claim you set together, then they will do that. And then that's up to you to decide, whether that's an environment that you feel you can stay in. But at least, if they've been put out there, it makes it easier for you to, keep returning to them as a shared, again, back to boundaries and expectations.
I like this reframe of permissions as rules. Even if, even when I feel I have no permission, I always can, at least for myself, list out all the rules I believe are in place. I don't need anyone else's permission to do that.
Right.
And I don't need to go confront or talk with anyone about those rules.
Yeah.
I can, now that I've made them visible to myself, I can test my understanding against what reality is actually
Right.
happening.
Right.
and adjust those to what I think. And then I have the ability to notice those discontinuities between what I think the rules are and when they seem to be broken. And then I can use that as a conversation, like you said, for
Right.
not the way we did things with this from everything I've seen. In this case, that didn't happen. And I'm wondering, is my understanding wrong? And then
Right.
we can start to kind of softly begin some of these conversations to bring that up more explicitly with our manager, peers, other people around that are involved in the group.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what I'm talking about when I work with themes of permission is about making our implicit sort of ways of operating and behaving, either as individuals or with each other, if we're talking about a team context, raising it to the level of the conscious and explicit so that we begin to see whether or not our defaults, are serving us, whether they ever have, whether they still are. And for me, those implicit rules are a key part of that. I would also I look at sort of what the autopilot behaviors are, the ways of doing things that just become feel like they're ingrained, even if they're not. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly important exercise now, particularly now with the whole five generations in the workplace, norms of work unraveling, only promising to do further. I think it's one of the key roles of a leader right now is to hold culture. And I put this under the rubric of culture in terms of how we operate together. I think being explicit and intentional about culture is, for me, would be right at the top of any leader's um, set of responsibilities. Because in the absence of it, there's so much room for conflict, for delay and hesitancy and all sorts of things that just are going to slow you down and frustrate you. So yeah, I think for me, I run whole things that are like rewriting the rules, which start with, okay, well, what are the rules? So to me, it's a really important exercise in creating a shared understanding of how we're supposed to operate together.
These are all ways where you help teams build cultures where they feel safe and empowered to bring their unique talents into everything that they do. I describe culture as how we lift each other up and how we stay out of each other's way.
Okay, I love
And
that.
that's everything that we've been
Mm,
that's everything that we've been
100%.
talking about today.
Yeah, very much so. I love that.
And you've gotten into this a little bit. What is the business value of doing all this work, creating these cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I have. I just, was there in terms of, I mean, if you want a bottom line sort of productivity and efficiency to me is, key in terms of, to use your language, staying out of each other's way. I think we're in a point now where we cannot expect to be on autopilot a lot. We can't always expect the way we've always done it to be the way that we need to keep doing it. So there's a premium, I think, now on sort of, low level adaptation and innovation and problem solving and pivoting and adapting, um, which is all contested ground, right? I don't know. I'm figuring it out. A lot of us right now are in kind of figure it out mode with a lot of things. And in that space, it's very easy to get into each other's way. It's very easy to pull each other down. It's very easy to have a sort of, I don't know, am I allowed to do this? Am I not? Do I need approval for that? So, if you're all just sort of, you know, on an assembly line churning things out in your own little bubble, it's, one thing. But if you're all in that kind of figure it out mode, in creative mode, in a space where, there's a lot of room for error, there's a lot of room for confusion, misunderstanding, then this kind of explicitness will serve you in terms not only of your efficiency and productivity, but your morale, your general ability to kind of keep getting better and keep learning. So, gosh, I mean, this is not a feel good thing at all. It might have been, it might have felt that way. And I think 20 years ago, when we still felt like we were operating in fairly sort of predictable territory, this felt like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we liked each other more or whatever? We talked more. I think now it's about working as an adaptive team. And that requires really good communication, really clear expectations, and as you've just said, not getting in each other's way.
And it strikes me that the more we can make explicit, then the more we can understand what is actually changing, what we're actually still have to figure out, and what might be staying the same or changing much more slowly that we hadn't realized, which for people who are not super comfortable with change gives them a much more solid foundation than they might have believed they had. And for people who are excited by change, then that gives them yet more visibility into how much change they're getting to experience and explore and play with. And for
Yeah.
everyone in the middle, it helps them on both of those sides.
Yeah, it brings them clarity, that they have a clear picture of that. But yeah, 100%. And you know what's so interesting is that what I often find is the two groups you mentioned on either side, super excited for change and very reluctant to change. It's almost like, this parts of the Venn diagram come a little bit closer together when you do this kind of thing, where you realize that, actually maybe we're not as far apart as we thought we were in terms of our expectations, our understanding of our current reality. I think particularly when you talk about sort of norms and expectations, often our perception of each other is skewed in terms of, a lot of these generational issues where we think we're polar opposites and actually we're not. There's a lot of common ground. There are ways in which those who are very change ready can then be of more service and support to those who are, change reluctant. And so, what I often it's an incredibly connective experience to create this more explicit set of rules, expectations, and boundaries because, I think 9 times out of 10 you realize that you've got much more keeping you together than pushing you apart.
I agree. And the more we understand what that is and how we prefer to work, then the more we understand how we can help each other.
Yeah.
Someone who is super spontaneous and doesn't want to have a schedule for anything and rules for anything, there's a whole lot of things that have to be done on a schedule and have to be done by rules. And knowing that I am not that, and I have these other people on my team who are that, then I can work with them to let them take that stuff they would probably love to do off my plate. And I can take any of the super changey, spontaneous, spontaneity requiring work that they maybe aren't so excited about doing. I can take that off their plate. And suddenly we're all much more able to work in the way that we work best and do the kind of work that we love, while also everything is still getting done probably much more effectively than it was before.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you put it that way, it's common sense, right? Like, why wouldn't you do that? Why don't we do that?
Why wouldn't
Um,
you?
why
Why don't
wouldn't
we?
you? I mean, it's like we all understand that we bring different styles and preferences and proclivities and ways of working. And, I think the reality is that now we need all that more because we're not, working in these very constrained environments. So some of the qualities and some of the ways that maybe used to get sort of left on the edges because they weren't deemed fit for a workplace, where we were squashed a little bit more into conforming to roles. We are now maybe a little bit more allowed to bring a little bit more of our specific way. Why not optimize that? Why not take advantage of it? Why not invite people to both own their preferences and how they work best, and to own, maybe their unique contributions. I kind of talk about it in the book as sort of, finding a fit as opposed to making people fit in. And so that does not make for a free for all. It doesn't say that you can do and be anything you want to be, but it does mean, as you've just described, how do we take who's here, who's in the room, and the way, excuse me, that they like to work and work best, and figure out how to work with that. Um, I think more teams are moving in that direction, but I also think we are in under a lot of pressure. The workplace is stressful and is bound to be more so as people navigate the implications of AI, as I think an insecurity around that seeps into people. I think it's going to be really important to just, continue to have these types of conversations.
The thought that just struck me is that we see this in other parts of our life in ways that often we feel we have more permission to deal with. For example, when we are looking for a new home or buying a new car or bicycle or lawnmower or dishwasher, it tends to be much more approved by friends, family, society, spouses, colleagues, to get the thing that fits us exactly and that has exactly the features we want and doesn't have what we don't want. That you want to live in the depths of downtown and I want to live out in rural nothingness, or I want the super fancy, all the gadgets dishwasher and you want one that turns on and off and gets things clean. And that's it.
Right, right.
And yet, when we come into the workplace, it's so often we're all supposed to be this interchangeable, fungible assets that
Right.
can be arranged at will,
Yeah.
which it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. Uh, there's a guy named Daniel Priestley. I don't know if you know who he is. He's an Australian kind of cultural commentator, futurist, but he made a comment that I found very interesting, which is that, from the Industrial Revolution to, sort of the knowledge economy and the corporate world of the late 20th century, the reality is that we have been groomed to be component labor. We fit parts, it's not the same as being the part of a car, but it's part of a big machine. And the mindset of that was exactly as you described. There was a pre-made role and you filled it. And I think for, the boomer generation, if I think about my father's generation and mother's generation, that was the mindset they took to it. There was a role that they were filling, and that role preceded them. And we interacted with each other via those roles. So you sort of your personality, yourself was well behind the, whatever sales director or marketing manager or whatever it was. And that has been to me, if in my book I talk about unravelings, that to me has been one of the key unravelings, is the kind of unraveling of the role as the container of your identity and the idea that it preceded you. And I mean, it just is carrying on apace now. And all the better, which I think is what you're implying, that why would we just be widgets in a large corporate machine? I think we're seeing Gen Z now kind of very clearly not wanting to be that. I think it's the source of a lot of resentment amongst those people who came into the workplace with that set of expectations. Back in my day, we just put our heads down and did our work and nobody cared and I got the job done sort of mindset. But I think we are, clawing our way out of that sort of component labor mindset to be something that is more of an individual, more of a creative and a creator, bringing a unique set of offerings to a situation. And there's so much, clumsy negotiation now around, okay, what does that look like? And which is what we're talking about. How much am I allowed to bring? What's out of bounds? And that's why I think as we are moving through all of this, We've got to deal with it. We've got to talk about it because we will have different expectations at this stage. It is very blurry. Um, so I think there's a deep desire among people to bring a fuller expression of themselves and their talents and their contributions. And I think there are still people who find that very threatening, who would like somebody to just sit down and do their job kind of thing.
Absolutely. It's becoming even more critical to that we can raise the level of abstraction that we understand of what our job is, what our role is, the work that we do is.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was fine to be someone who wrote code or
Right.
did accounting or
Right.
was a salesperson.
Yep.
And that's not enough now because those are the roles that AI is quickly taking over.
Yeah.
But those were never actually the output that anyone cared about, even if that was what people believed it was the output they cared about or what they believed that they were creating. It was always something higher up. And I'm starting to believe that the bigger thing that each of us is always trying to do, whether we're writing code or talking to customers to convince them that the product we buy is better than anyone we make is better than anyone else's, or we're keeping the books to help everyone have the money to be able to do everything else. That what we are fundamentally doing is solving problems. We're solving problems that help our business continue being a going concern, that help our teammates work better, that we're finding better, more effective, more efficient, more fun, more playful, more exciting ways to lift each other up and stay out of each other's way.
Yeah, I
And
think that's
that
true.
is a puzzle that will never be solved.
No, but I think what's happening right now is this acceleration of what you've just described, that idea of problem solving as the kind of unit of engagement. What am I doing here? If routine functions and routine elements of operating are about to be, handled by machines, then the human contribution will, I think, even more starkly be around, among other things, that idea that I'm here to do something with a clearly defined output. And so, that's a very different mindset, isn't it? That you enter into an engagement around. And, I really do think I talk in my book about this idea of free agency, that I think we are going to see ourselves as less of, a job or a role, and potentially operate like free agents, solving problems in different places for a time being, for a long while. I'm not saying it would entirely be gig based per se, but I do think that, something that is more focused around a specific, project, task, challenge will likely um, shape our understanding of what we're doing more. And I think there's great potential in that because I think it might help us to tap into a little bit more of our value add a little more easily.
I agree. One of the reasons I've always loved technology, and one of the promises of ever increasing, more capable technology for me is that it allows each of us to take more control and have more depth available in the way that we're solving problems.
Yeah.
There used to be the way I could solve problems is I could talk with someone and I could talk with them on the phone, where I was stuck to a wired thing on the wall, or I could go meet them in person, and that was pretty much it. I could send them a letter if I wanted a very async conversation. Now we can have live Zoom meetings where we can be face-to-face and almost as good as being in person without having all the travel involved.
Yeah.
We can talk with AI and have a conversation to build an application that's exactly customized to the thing I need for the next 5 minutes, and then maybe I throw it away.
Right.
Or people who never would have considered being computer programmers can now have these conversations with AI and build applications that are exactly what they need, exactly what their clients need.
Right.
And it's so much more ability to solve the problem we're working on right now with precision and clarity, like we've been
Yeah.
saying throughout the conversation today.
Yeah. And I think, I'm in this weird position where I absolutely understand the perceived threat of it and the real threat of it. I get it that it is forcing a very profound reckoning with our relationship to work, with our relationship to labor and, human labor and what its value add is. Um, and I don't think we are, as societies, engaging with the implications of it to the extent that we could and probably should. As a solopreneur, whatever I want to call myself, I feel liberated and empowered like never before. As you've just described, I created my own website. I've built an app to go along with my book. I feel like it has changed my life and given me a set of capabilities that were unthinkable 6 months ago. So, it's complex, the ways in which it's going to free us to create, and force us to redefine what it is that we're here for. And I think, for a lot of us, it's going to help us, as everybody's saying, sort of 10x what we can do. And I think we are facing a lot of people who are going to be having very profound identity crises as a result.
So much change, uncertainty, and overwhelm on the way and already here.
Already
How
here.
do you help people find their way through all? How do you help people find their way through all of that?
One step at a time. I think, obviously that's the theme of the book is we've got to find our way through this period of ever accelerating uncertainty and overwhelm and change, as you've just described. And, when I started writing the book, AI wasn't even on our minds the way it is now. So I kind of smiled to myself that I started it during COVID, which was, of course, I think the first global, you know, hi, we're about to blow up your sense of, seamless normalcy that has shaped your understanding of how you operate for a very long time. And now it's like all bets are off. Um, I think, I think, one of the things that I talk about now is how I think like individual change management, personal change management needs to now be considered like a 21st century skill set, capability, whatever you want to call it. So many of the things that we've done at an organizational level, I think now we need to kind of shrink them down into our own lives where we are going to have to sort of oil the ability to surf change as a routine part of our lives, not as a periodic disruption. And that's very, very different to how we've been raised and trained. I think it is a profound coming into self. We do not have, I describe it as finding your way versus following the way. So there were very clearly paved paths and people telling us where to go. And now we have to rely more on ourselves. So I think we have to start cultivating a relationship with ourselves that's very different than any of our parents did, where we are far more, looking inwards before we look outwards, listening to and validating some of our own desires and opinions, because we are our own guides. There are no trusted guides anymore. There's millions of them. There's none of them. It's on us to decide this and the communities that we choose to create where we can, consult and support each other. But I think, there's so much opportunity in terms of relationship to self. and personal agency, which I do believe is now, I think education needs to shift quite fundamentally to really harnessing individual agency in a way that it never has. So, um, I think it's come a lot of work on self, and it doesn't have to be big. It's a practice. I'm sort of thinking in terms of like the fitness industry these days, in terms of that capability, that muscle, that tone, if you will, to be able to do these things. It's like you've got choice muscles, and you need to work them and keep them strong. So I think we've all got work to do on ourselves.
Yes, we do. And one of the lovely things about this work in particular is that, as you said, it doesn't have to be a lot. Even a tiny bit more ability
Yeah,
makes everything else so much easier. It makes it so much easier to get the next tiny bit and the next tiny bit, the next tiny bit. So it's
totally.
not that we have to walk into the choice gym and start lifting 2,000
No,
pounds. We can start with
no.
half an ounce, and that's going to make a world of difference.
When somebody buys the book, they'll get a QR code to a getting started workbook, and it's about managing your days, and it particularly directs you to your weekends. And I think that if I'm going to call the weekend your choice gym, since you just used that, and I like that, because you've got 1,000 choices to make over a weekend, and many of us never make any. We just sort of sleepwalk through them, and yet they're wonderful places for us to start to get super intentional about how we're operating. And for me, that's what we're talking about here. So as you say, I tell people go for the low consequence, high pleasure choices first. And I know it's going to feel frivolous, and I know you won't care. But trust me, one little ounce of you becoming more intentional about your everyday, what do I want to eat? What do I want on my pizza? Do I get the same thing every day because I'm on autopilot? Why don't I start like making myself try new things, experience new things? All of those things are the foundational muscles of choice, of curiosity, of receptivity, of a willingness to kind of show up to a different situation and navigate it. And that's what I think we're being called upon to do now. And we can start to build that capacity within our existing lives in all sorts of pleasurable ways. So, I think this mental model of whenever we're talking about personal growth or human growth, it's big and it's heavy and it's problematic and it's about fixing something. It's like, no, it's not. I don't want you to fix any problems. This is not about that. This is about you tapping into your ability to, design your days, make intentional choices. And as you've just said, it's amazing what happens when you just start doing that in small ways. The compounding of it is far greater than you imagine before you start doing it.
It really is. And for people who would like to talk to Jillian to get your help in compounding their experiences, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
My website has pretty much all the information about what I'm currently offering. I guess as a first offer, there's obviously the book, which is the foundational ideas. There will be, and there is currently a download on my website, but the book is the basic ideas along with the workbook that I just mentioned. One of the other things that I'm building very intentionally right now is community. Um, the book is important, but it's for an individual, and I think part of the challenge that we have right now is that we're heaped with responsibility and pressure to figure all of this out on our own, and it feels hard, and yet we're all doing it side by side in our own little silos. So, it was important to me in creating the book to set out to create a community to go along with it, where, a million individual permission slips become social permission, where I realize that I'm not the only leader who goes into work and feels like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm supposed to have all the answers. Instead, all I have is questions. When I realize that I'm not the only 40-year-old facing a layoff who doesn't know what to do and is scared to death of what AI is going to do to my career. Like, we need to make these things public. We need to have these conversations, not, in shame, but as a reality of living in an unbelievably volatile world. So go check out my website, pick up the book, join the community, start to kind of play around with what some of this might look like in your own life.
Thank you. And we'll have links for all that in the show notes. What would you like to leave our audience with today, Jillian?
Gosh, we've touched on so many important things. I think, part of what we kind of got to here around, I mean, there's a couple of things. I think we touched on some important things, which is, two things that I think we underestimate, which is what happens when you make the implicit explicit and how much easier it is to kind of address things in your life. And then I think the ways in which super small incremental changes compound and kind of begin to give you a sense of space and capability that you didn't know you had. Because I think a lot of people right now are laboring under a lot of what feels like big, heavy decisions, big, heavy stuff they've got to deal with in their lives. And I guess I would love for them to know that, it's okay. We're all in the same place. We're all trying to figure this out. You're not alone. I know so many people who feel inadequate, like they're not a good enough leader because they aren't as decisive and visionary as they think they should be. They feel like they're muddling along. And I guess I want people to know that I think that's part of being alive right now. I don't know a lot of people who have everything figured out and feel totally solid. So, just to know it's okay. We're all in the same place and we're all figuring it out. And I think the more that we give ourselves permission to do it with intention and boldness and clarity, and the more that we give ourselves permission to do it together, the easier it will start to feel.
And on top of all of that, the more we give ourselves permission to realize all the ways we believe we're failing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I talk about people right now, and I think this is particularly important for leaders who are trapped between yesterday's expectations and today's realities. Because I think a lot of us are still carrying around this kind of inspirational Jack Welch style, like, leader in our head. And that's what good looks like. And we feel like a failure because we're not, standing up. As I said, most of the leaders I know right now are really struggling to get by, and they feel like failures. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think the permission to rewrite the leadership script and the leadership story to be more of a figuring it out, finding your way, as I describe it, sort of more explorer, less executive. Um, you know, you're heading into new territory. There's no way that you're going to be like, cool, let's go. We're all on, cruising forward together. Like, and that feeling of failure, I think, it limits your ability to actually respond to all of this in your most real, creative, thoughtful way because you're hiding in some ways. So, yeah, I think we need to feel permitted not to hide all the ways in which this moment and these realities are challenging us.
Thank you, Jillian, for a wonderful conversation today.
Oh, thank you. I just, as I said when we started, I love what you're doing. So I'm so pleased that I could, yeah, explore more of our shared interests.
Myself as well. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. Jillian and I would love to know, how are you giving yourselves permission to do more tiny experiments and be less bound by rules? We would love to hear.
Absolutely.
Thanks, and have a great day.